It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A group of friends, Sarah, Mike, Jenna, and Chris, decided to take a trip deep into the Appalachian Mountains, far away from the chaos of the city. The four of them had been camping for years, but this time they wanted something different. A remote location, untouched by civilization, where they could truly be alone in nature. They found a site on an obscure website, a listing for a pristine and secluded campground that promised total isolation. That was exactly what they were looking for. The drive up was scenic, the mountain roads winding through dense woods, the sunlight flickering through the trees as if welcoming them. The site was located miles off any paved road, accessible only by a narrow dirt trail. It was perfect. As they unpacked the car and set up their tents, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest. The air smelled of pine and earth, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. As night fell, they built a campfire, its orange glow casting eerie shapes onto the surrounding trees. They laughed and swapped stories, the flames flickering in sync with their words. The woods around them were silent, unnaturally so, as if the forest was holding its breath. At first, no one noticed. They chalked it up to the isolation. The further you were from civilization, the quieter things seemed to be. But as the hours passed, a feeling of unease crept in. Sarah was the first to mention it. "Does anyone else feel off? Like we're being watched?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant, as if speaking it aloud would make it real. Mike laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's just the woods. We're not used to being this far out. That's all." Jenna agreed, though her eyes darted nervously toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Chris stayed quiet, poking at the fire with a stick, his brow furrowed. The night deepened, and the uneasy feeling only grew. The forest, which had been silent earlier, now seemed alive with sounds, branches snapping in the distance, leaves rustling, the faintest whisper of movement just beyond their sight. It felt as if something was circling them, staying just out of reach, waiting. Jenna stood abruptly. "I'm going to the bathroom. Be right back," she said, heading toward the line of trees just beyond the campsite. Minutes passed. Sarah, Mike, and Chris sat in awkward silence, their eyes scanning the darkness. Finally, Sarah broke the tension. "She's been gone a while," she said, glancing toward the trees. Mike shrugged, but his face was tense. "Give her a minute. She probably just got turned around." Another 10 minutes passed. The air seemed to grow colder, the fire crackling too loud in the quiet night. Sarah stood up. "I'm going to check on her." Before Mike or Chris could protest, Sarah was already moving toward the trees. She disappeared into the darkness, the light from the campfire quickly swallowed by the shadows. Mike and Chris exchanged worried glances. After what felt like an eternity, they heard a scream. It was Sarah. They jumped to their feet, fear lancing through them. Chris grabbed a flashlight and they ran toward the sound, calling Sarah's name. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in ghostly flashes. They found Sarah standing a few yards in, pale and shaking. She pointed wordlessly to the ground. There in the dirt were footprints, not Jenna's. They were larger, deeper, and there were too many of them, circling the area where Jenna had gone. "Where's Jenna?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. I found these, and I heard something else out here." Panic set in. They called out for Jenna, their voices echoing in the stillness, but there was no response. The forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. Finally, they decided to head back to the camp, thinking Jenna might have returned on her own. When they arrived, the fire was out, the campsite disturbingly quiet. Their gear was scattered as if someone or something had been rummaging through it. Jenna was nowhere to be found. Chris scanned the area with the flashlight, and that's when they saw it. Carved into a nearby tree, deep gouges in the bark were the words, "Leave now." Sarah gasped, backing away. Mike cursed under his breath, his face pale. Chris tightened his grip on the flashlight, his hands shaking. "We need to go," Mike said, his voice urgent. "Now." They hurriedly packed up their gear, the eerie silence only broken by the sound of their panicked breathing. Just as they were about to leave, they heard a rustling from the edge of the camp. The beam of Chris's flashlight swung toward the sound, and they saw Jenna. But something was wrong. She stood at the edge of the trees, her back to them, her posture unnaturally rigid. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung limply around her face. She didn't move. Jenna? Sarah whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. Jenna didn't respond. Jenna! Mike shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Slowly, Jenna turned around, but it wasn't the Jenna they knew. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and unblinking, her skin pale as if she had been drained of life. Blood trickled from her mouth, and her arms hung limply at her sides. She didn't say a word, didn't make a sound. Without warning, she let out a guttural scream, a sound so inhuman, so filled with rage and pain, that it seemed to vibrate through the air. Then she sprinted toward them, faster than any human should be able to move. They ran. Branches whipped at their faces as they tore through the forest, the sound of Jenna's screams echoing behind them. They didn't stop, not even when their legs burned, not even when they tripped and fell, scrambling to get back up. The woods seemed endless, the darkness all-consuming, Jenna's unnatural wails growing fainter but never disappearing entirely. Somehow they made it back to the car, throwing themselves inside, locking the doors with trembling hands. Mike floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the dirt before catching traction and speeding down the narrow trail. No one spoke. No one dared look back. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, miles away from the campsite. It was only then, as they sat in a brightly lit diner, shaking and exhausted, that they realized something. Jenna's backpack had been in the car the whole time, but Jenna hadn't. There were always rumors about Devil's Peak, a jagged, menacing mountain deep in the Rockies where hikers would mysteriously vanish. Some said the mountain was cursed, others claimed it was haunted, but no one who had gone missing there was ever found, and no one who dared go searching for them ever returned. The locals avoided the area, warning tourists to stay far away, but a group of 4 thrill-seeking campers, Anna, Paul, Jen, and Alex, were drawn to it like moths to a flame. They wanted adventure, something beyond the typical weekend camping trip, and the stories only fueled their excitement. They didn't believe in curses or ghosts. To them, Devil's Peak was just another challenge to conquer. Armed with tents, flashlights, and enough supplies for 3 days, they set out into the wilderness, laughing off the warnings of the locals. The first day was uneventful. The trail leading up the mountain was steep and rugged, but manageable. They made camp halfway up, under the shadow of the looming peak. As they set up their tents, the wind whistled through the trees, making strange, mournful sounds, but they shrugged it off as nothing more than the natural ambience of the forest. That night, as they sat around the campfire, a thick fog rolled in, creeping between the trees like fingers of smoke. The temperature dropped suddenly, and with it came an oppressive silence. No crickets chirped, no leaves rustled, just the eerie stillness of the fog-shrouded forest. Anyone else feeling a little off? Jen asked, breaking the silence. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Paul chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to it. It's just the mountain playing tricks on us. Don't let the spooky stories get to you. Alex poked at the fire, but didn't say anything. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that they were being watched ever since they set up camp. Hours passed, and the fog grew thicker, enveloping their camp like a heavy blanket. Their laughter had died down, and now only the crackling of the fire filled the void. Anna glanced around uneasily, her eyes scanning the thick wall of fog that surrounded them. Then they heard it, a faint whisper, so low it was barely audible, carried on the wind. At first, they thought it was their imagination, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, angry, accusing. Jen sat up straighter, her eyes wide. Did you hear that? No one responded. The whispers seemed to swirl around them, coming from all directions, closing in. Alex stood up, shining his flashlight into the fog, but the beam was swallowed by the thick mist, illuminating nothing but gray. Hello? He called out, though his voice wavered. Who's out there? Silence. Then, without warning, something moved in the fog, just a flicker of motion, so quick they almost missed it. It was gone before any of them could react. Paul stood up, grabbing the flashlight from Alex. Let's check it out. Probably some animal. Anna shook her head, her face pale. No, we shouldn't. We should stay by the fire. But Paul and Alex were already stepping away from the campsite, their flashlights cutting through the dense fog. Jen and Anna exchanged uneasy glances, but followed. The fog seemed to thicken the further they went, pressing in around them, muffling their footsteps. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was so abrupt, so complete, it was deafening. Then the smell hit them. It was foul, like something rotting, something dead. The stench was overwhelming, thick in the air, causing them to gag and cover their noses. Paul swung the flashlight around, searching for the source. The beam landed on something. It was a figure, standing just a few feet away, barely visible through the fog. At first, they thought it was a person, tall, with hunched shoulders. But as they moved closer, they saw the truth. It wasn't human. The thing was emaciated, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, gray and mottled like a corpse left to rot in the sun. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. It stood completely still, as if waiting. Then, its head snapped toward them. Jen screamed, stumbling backward as the thing lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Paul dropped the flashlight in his panic, the beam flickering wildly as it hit the ground. "Run!" Alex shouted, grabbing Anna's arm and pulling her back toward the camp. They sprinted through the fog, the sound of the thing's dragging footsteps behind them, closer and closer. The fog was disorienting, making it hard to see, hard to breathe, but they didn't stop. Jen was sobbing, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and Anna could hear Paul cursing under his breath. When they finally made it back to the campsite, they collapsed by the fire, panting, hearts pounding in their chests. But the whispers had returned, louder now, angry, accusing. The fog seemed to pulse with them, as if it was alive. "We need to get out of here," Anna gasped, scrambling to her feet. "Now." But just as they were about to grab their gear, the fog parted, revealing something even more horrifying. Around the campfire stood more of the figures, dozens of them circling the camp, their hollow eyes fixed on the four of them. They moved slowly, their limbs stiff and unnatural, their bodies barely visible through the swirling mist. One of them stepped forward, and that's when they saw it clearly. The tattered remains of a hiking jacket hung loosely from its skeletal frame. A flash of recognition passed between them. It was the jacket Paul's brother had been wearing when he disappeared on this mountain 2 years ago. Paul stumbled backward, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. No, it can't be, but there was no mistaking it. The thing wearing the jacket stepped closer, its mouth opening in a grotesque grin, as if it recognized him too. Before anyone could react, the circle of figures began to close in, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. There was no escape. The fog swallowed their screams, and the fire sputtered out, leaving nothing but darkness. A group of 5 friends, Rachel, Tom, Eric, Lisa, and Matt, had been planning their camping trip for months. They were headed to Pine Hollow, an isolated campground deep in the woods far from the nearest town. The locals warned them about it, but they dismissed the talk as small-town superstitions. The legend of Pine Hollow was infamous. People who camped there would wake up to find strange markings on their tents, and sometimes people would vanish without a trace. They chalked it up to ghost stories meant to scare tourists. The drive was long, and by the time they reached the trailhead leading to Pine Hollow, the sun had already begun to dip behind the mountains, casting the forest in dark, muted shades of purple and gray. The trail was overgrown, the trees closing in around them as they made their way deeper into the woods. By the time they reached the campsite, night had fallen. They quickly set up their tents and got a fire going, the crackling flames providing some much-needed comfort against the encroaching darkness. The thick woods surrounding them were unnervingly quiet. No wind, no animals, just the oppressive stillness of the night. They spent the evening telling ghost stories, laughing at how eerie the place was, but no one could shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt too silent, too watchful. Tom, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off as nothing more than nerves, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Later, as the fire burned low and the cold began to settle in, they all retreated to their tents. The air was crisp, the forest dead silent around them. Rachel lay awake, listening to the stillness, her thoughts drifting back to the locals' warnings. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a faint scraping sound, just outside her tent. Her heart pounded as she held her breath, straining to listen. The sound was soft but unmistakable, like something scratching at the fabric of her tent. She told herself it was just a branch or a small animal, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She glanced over at Lisa, who was already fast asleep beside her. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, Rachel reached for her flashlight, her hands trembling as she flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of her tent, but she couldn't bring herself to unzip the flap and see what was outside. She stared at the fabric, hoping it was her imagination. Then, the scratching stopped. Rachel's breath hitched. She waited, every muscle in her body tense, listening for any sign of movement. Seconds ticked by in silence. Then, from across the campsite came a low, guttural moan. It wasn't human. Rachel's blood ran cold. She sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. The moan came again, closer this time, rising in pitch like something in pain or something hunting. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she typed a message into the group chat. "Did anyone else hear that?" No one responded. Suddenly, the sound of a tent zipper being ripped open cut through the silence. It was followed by a blood-curdling scream. Eric's scream. Rachel shot up, grabbing Lisa and shaking her awake. "Lisa, wake up! Something's wrong with Eric!" Lisa groggily sat up, but before Rachel could explain, another scream rang out, this time from Tom's tent. It was a scream filled with pure terror, the kind that made Rachel's stomach drop. She unzipped her tent and stepped outside, her flashlight beam trembling in the dark. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak, flickering light across the campsite. Tom's tent was in shreds, the fabric torn apart, but there was no sign of him. Eric's tent was the same, completely destroyed, with no trace of Eric. "What the hell is going on?" Matt yelled, emerging from his own tent, wild-eyed and panicked. Before anyone could answer, a shadow moved in the trees just beyond the campsite. Rachel swung her flashlight toward it, the beam catching something pale and gaunt, too tall, too thin, standing just at the edge of the trees. It was watching them. "Run!" Matt shouted, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her into the woods. Rachel and Tom sprinted after them, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran, branches slashing at their faces. The thing in the woods let out another moan, this one deeper, more guttural, and they heard it crashing through the underbrush behind them. It was fast, too fast. Rachel's lungs burned as she pushed herself to keep running, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it gaining on them, the sound of its heavy, unnatural footsteps closing in. They burst into a clearing, and for a moment, Rachel thought they might be safe. But then a scream tore through the night. Lisa's scream. Rachel skidded to a stop and turned around just in time to see Lisa being dragged into the darkness, her fingers clawing at the dirt, her face twisted in terror. "Lisa!" Matt screamed, running after her, but it was too late. She was gone. Panic surged through Rachel as she grabbed Matt, pulling him back. "We have to keep moving." They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing at the edge of a cliff, the forest stretching out below them like a sea of darkness. Rachel's chest heaved as she gasped for air, her whole body trembling. The forest was silent again, but they knew it was still out there, watching. Matt collapsed beside her, sobbing. What was that thing? Where's everyone else? Rachel didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the legends about Pine Hollow weren't just stories. They sat there in silence, staring out into the dark woods, too afraid to move, too afraid to go back. Hours passed and the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. For a moment, Rachel allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had escaped. But then she heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of scratching. This time it was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, her blood turning to ice. There, standing just a few feet away, was the creature. It was taller than she had imagined, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its hollow eyes fixed on her. In its hand it held something small, something familiar. Lisa's necklace. The last thing Rachel heard before everything went dark was the sound of the creature's moan, low and hungry, echoing through the trees. There's an old, unmarked road in the middle of nowhere that locals call Dead Man's Trail. It doesn't show up on maps, and there are no signs to warn you before you turn onto it. The road winds through dense, suffocating woods, and those who venture down it swear they can hear whispers coming from the trees. Nobody knows when the road was first built, but everyone knows one thing. Once you enter Dead Man's Trail, you don't come back the same, if you come back at all. The stories always intrigued Jessica and her friends, a group of 6 who had a thirst for the eerie and the unexplained. Despite the warnings from locals and a deep, primal sense of unease, they made a plan to spend one night camping off Dead Man's Trail. They were convinced the legends were just that, legends, nothing more than creepy stories meant to keep people away from the woods. The drive was long, and by the time they reached the unmarked road, the sun was setting, casting the forest in blood-red light. The road itself was narrow and overgrown, the trees pressing in on both sides, their gnarled branches stretching overhead like twisted fingers. As soon as they turned onto it, the temperature seemed to drop and an unnatural stillness settled over the woods. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. Jessica glanced at her friends, Mark, Sophie, Ben, Emily, and Jake, trying to push away the growing feeling of dread gnawing at her stomach. They laughed and joked, but it was forced. No one could deny the strange, suffocating atmosphere that clung to the air. They drove for what felt like hours, the road winding deeper and deeper into the forest. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. There were no animal sounds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of the car's engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eventually, they found a small clearing just off the road, a perfect place to set up camp. They unloaded their gear, pitched their tents, and built a fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the trees, making them look like towering figures lurking at the edge of the light. They huddled close to the fire, trying to shake off the cold that seemed to seep into their bones despite the heat. As the night wore on, the fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the air. They told ghost stories, trying to laugh away their fear, but something was wrong. The deeper they ventured into their stories, the more they felt it. A presence, watching, waiting. Then it started. The sound was faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackling fire. A soft, rhythmic tapping like footsteps coming from the trees. Mark was the first to notice, his face paling as he looked toward the woods. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Everyone fell silent, listening. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was unmistakable now, growing louder, closer. Jessica's heart raced as she grabbed a flashlight, shining it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trunks and dense underbrush, but there was nothing there. "Maybe it's an animal," Jake suggested, though his voice wavered. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps were getting louder, closing in from all sides. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone, or something, walking around down the edge of their campsite. Emily stood up, her eyes wide with fear. "I think we should leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could respond, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was even worse than the footsteps. The air was thick with tension, like the moment before a storm. Then from the trees came a voice. "Help me." It was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down Jessica's spine. It didn't sound quite right. Too flat, too emotionless. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, clutching Ben's arm. They all nodded, frozen in place. The voice came again, a little louder this time. "Help me, please." Mark stood up, grabbing his flashlight. "Someone's out there," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to check." Jessica grabbed his arm. "Don't," she warned. "Something's wrong." But Mark shook her off and stepped toward the edge of the clearing, shining his flashlight into the trees. The others followed, unwilling to stay behind in the eerie silence of the camp. The voice was closer now, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. "Help me, I'm lost." Mark took another step toward the trees. "Hello," he called out. "Where are you?" There was a long pause, and then the voice responded, "Here." The word was soft, barely a whisper, but it seemed to come from all around them. The woods felt alive, the darkness pressing in on them, thick and suffocating. "Where are you?" Mark called again, stepping deeper into the trees, his flashlight beam trembling as he scanned the woods. Silence. Then, from behind them, the voice whispered, "Right here." Jessica spun around, her flashlight flickering as it illuminated the campsite. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a figure, a man, tall and thin, his skin pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his mouth hanging open in an unnatural, eerie grin. He was still, too still, like a statue, watching them. "Mark," Jessica whispered, backing away slowly, "we need to go." But before they could move, the figure spoke again, its voice the same flat, emotionless tone. "Help me." It took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Sophie's hand and sprinting back toward the car. The others followed, their hearts pounding as they stumbled through the underbrush. Behind them, the figure's footsteps echoed through the trees, steady and relentless. "Help me." The voice was closer now, too close. They reached the car, scrambling inside and slamming the doors shut. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. The car sputtered to life, and they tore down the narrow road, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. No one spoke. The only sound was the roar of the engine and their ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the highway, leaving Dead Man's Trail behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, pulling into the parking lot of a gas station, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. As they sat there in the harsh fluorescent light, trying to make sense of what had just happened, Jessica glanced in the rearview mirror. Her blood ran cold. Standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure. Its wide, unblinking eyes were fixed on them, its mouth twisted into that same unnatural grin. And then, in a voice that echoed in the deepest corners of their minds, it whispered one last time. 3 years ago, the sleepy town of Willow Creek was rocked by a series of gruesome disappearances, all centered around a dense, foreboding stretch of woods known as Black Hollow Forest. The locals spoke of strange occurrences in the area, animals acting erratically, strange lights flickering in the trees at night, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. They warned anyone who'd listen to stay far away, but after the fourth disappearance, the stories started to fade, replaced by fear and silence. The forest grew darker, more ominous, like it was keeping secrets. No one dared enter anymore. But that didn't stop 4 curious college students, Megan, Josh, Sarah, and David, from wanting to explore it for themselves. They were amateur paranormal investigators, always looking for the next thrill, and Black Hollow Forest seemed like the perfect challenge. Megan had found an old article online about the forest and convinced the others to join her for a weekend trip to see if they could uncover anything about the disappearances. They packed their gear, flashlights, cameras, audio recorders, and tents, and headed to the forest one late October afternoon, eager to uncover what everyone else was too afraid to face. The air grew colder as they approached the forest, and a strange stillness settled over them. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees, and even the crunch of leaves beneath their boots seemed muted. They set up camp near the edge of the turban to spend the night investigating. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the trees in long, jagged shadows, they built a fire and sat around it, going over their plan. Megan was in charge of recording audio, hoping to capture EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, while Josh and Sarah would film their surroundings and looking for any strange activity. David, always the skeptic, would monitor the gear and document anything unusual. For the first few hours, nothing happened. They explored deeper into the forest, finding nothing more than old trees and thick underbrush. But as the night wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over them, like the forest itself was watching them. Around midnight, Megan suddenly stopped, her head cocked to the side as she listened intently. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Everyone froze, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the woods came the unmistakable sound of children laughing. Sarah let out a nervous laugh, but it died quickly. "It's probably just the wind, right?" Megan shook her head, her face pale. "No, that's not the wind." They stood there, paralyzed, as the laughter grew louder, circling around them. But it wasn't joyful. It was hollow, eerie, and unnatural, like it was coming from every direction at once. David, the ever-skeptic, grunted, "It's got to be a trick. Someone's messing with us." But deep down, they all knew better. Without a word, Megan pulled out her audio recorder and hit record, her hands shaking. "If there's anyone here with us, make yourself known," she called out into the dark, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. Then from behind them came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They whipped around, shining their flashlights in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and shadows. "Hello?" Josh called, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" No response. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was deathly still. Then, out of nowhere, something slammed into Josh, knocking him to the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, and the beam flickered out as he scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, backing toward the others. "I didn't see anything," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Megan, shaking, played back the recording. At first, there was only the crackling of static and their own voices. Then, clear as day, a voice whispered from the speakers, "You shouldn't have come." The four of them stared at the recorder, their blood running cold. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Now." But as they turned to head back to camp, something moved in the trees ahead of them. A figure, tall, thin, and gaunt, stepped out of the shadows. Its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. Who are you?" David called out, his voice trembling. The figure took a step forward, and as it did, the temperature plummeted. The breath of the four friends hung in the air, visible in the freezing cold. The figure tilted its head, almost as if it was considering them. Then, in a voice that sounded both far away and right next to them, it whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." Suddenly, the laughter returned, louder now, echoing all around them. The trees seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as the figure took another step forward. Josh grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back. "Run!" he shouted. They sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at their clothes and faces as the laughter followed them, growing louder and more maniacal with each passing second. Behind them they could hear the figure's footsteps, slow and deliberate, never running, but always right behind them. They reached the camp in a panic, throwing their gear into their bags, but the forest was alive now. The trees groaned, the wind howled, and that terrible laughter surrounded them, growing more chaotic by the second. "We have to go," Megan screamed, but as they turned toward the path leading back to their car, they froze. The figure was standing in the middle of the trail, blocking their way. It smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The laughter swirled around them, deafening, and the figure's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "You're never leaving." The ground beneath them began to shift, as if the forest itself was swallowing them whole. Roots twisted up from the earth, wrapping around their legs, pulling them down. They screamed, fighting to break free, but it was no use. The forest had them now. The last thing Megan saw before everything went dark was the figure's hollow eyes watching her, its smile growing wider as the world around her faded. The next morning, a search party found their campsite. Tents torn apart, gear scattered, but no sign of Megan, Josh, Sarah, or David. They were never seen again. And now, late at night, if you listen closely near Black Hollow Forest, you can still hear it, the faint sound of children laughing and the whisper of a voice warning you to stay away.